Torna a Fem Ciència, una sèrie per repensar el feminisme, la història i la cultura científica. Aquesta quarta temporada està dedicada a la història mediambiental. Avui parlarem amb Roberta Biasillo, investigadora i professora a la Universitat d'Utrecht. És secretària de l'European Society for Environmental History i els seus temes d'estudi s'emmarquen en la història ambiental, el colonialisme ecològic i el feixisme italià. És la història de la ciència sexista?
Sexist in the sense that there is an overexposition, or at least for a long time there has been an overexposition of white male scholars in the discipline of environmental history, and most of these men were from the US. So at least for the years of the 1980s and 1990s, generally environmental history was strongly associated with big names from the US. Although we also need to say that one of the major scholars that founded the discipline is Caroline Merchant. So there was at the very beginning of the environmental history a strong attention to the gender, also as a missing category, but this tension towards the gender has been present in the 80s and in the 90s. And one of the major theorization of the environmental history, so the theory of ecological revolution, is based on gender, and gender is it's not based on gender, but gender is a major component of it. I have to say that environmental history did not develop so much the theory of ecofeminism. So I think that the field is also changing a lot and is self-reflecting on the role of women. So there are several platforms that have emerged recently. So there is the platform Environmental History Now, that is specifically for underrepresented groups. And then there's the network of women working in environmental history. And there's also more broadly another network, so Women Also Know History. So things are changing, and probably there will be even more space for feminist or environmental history or environmental history of feminism. Yeah.
Quin paper té la història de la ciència en la lluita pel canvi climàtic?
It's a big question, and of course, in epistemic terms, investigating climate change from the perspective of the humanists is very useful, because we can first of all show human responsibility in creating the effects of climate change. But also we can highlight the role of humans in shaping also the epistemology of climate change. So how we elaborate science and big data is very human. It doesn't mirror nature. It's just one human representation of nature. And I think history here can really do a big job in exploring this connection between science production and the representation of nature. And then, of course, I mean, humanists can highlight the role of feelings and how we connect to the environment, and they can also generate a sense of empowerment. They can mobilize us from a political point of view, so we know what we are losing, and we also can discover our own common history if we can use history as an empowerment tool for communities. But I think the interesting part is also to look at what climate change does on our disciplines. Is the idea of using the Anthropocene as a double sort of like concept. So on the one hand, we see the effects of what humans are producing on the environment, but on the other side, history in particular helped to undermine this category of humans as an homogeneous categories, because we can look at the differentiated responsibility in terms of geography, in terms of ethnicity, gender, and also more like deep terms. If we look at what is happening to our disciplines, I think we are really reframing the concept of temporality. So it's not only the time of the humans that is important, but it's also the time of the planet, the time of other species. And we are undermining a bit this super anthropocentric conception of history. So I think climate change is also affecting the way in which we conduct history, because we don't have this sense of progress and the fact that future will be for sure in front of us for the next centuries. So I think it's changing the structure of the discipline itself.
En un dels teus articles parles de l'envelliment dels turons de la Toscana. Com es forma aquesta idea? Com afecta la identitat cultural i el patrimoni?
Here I moved from a very personal experience, because the year I wrote that article I was living in Florence. So I took several trips around Tuscany, and one of these trips was in Val d'Orcia. Val d'Orcia is a UNESCO heritage site, and indeed it features movies and artworks from the Middle Ages until modern times. So it's the quintessential idea of the Italian beautiful landscape. And so I started thinking, what is the role of beauty? And what beauty can say to visitors and to historians, and that these two messages are quite different. So I think one of the role of the historians is to try to bridge and understanding what are the dynamics of creating a beautiful landscape for the fruition of visitors or for a foreign audience, and then what is the sense of living in a beautiful countryside for people who live that area. So, and the way in which this small town, Faenza, that is in Val d'Orcia, was sold and branded by the UNESCO was basically a very peaceful, neutral place crafted only by art, culture, Toscan history, and it described it as a place outside the time. But if we look at the same landscape with the eyes of the historian, we can see something else. So what Bill Cronon called the traces in the land. So what we saw there, to me, looked like the outcome of centuries of an oppressive system of agrarian conduction. So what is called in Italian mezzadria, so this very specific agrarian contract in which people are linked to the land and they are under control by the owner of the land. So that part of injustice, of human work, is completely missed by this idea of beauty. But that was actually what created the beauty of the landscape and really draw the landscape as a piece of art. So yeah, maybe there are more dimensions than we should highlight when we talk about the beauty of a place.
Podem trobar connexions ecològiques a tots els projectes polítics. En la dictadura de Mussolini, natura i feixisme són inseparables. Ens podries parlar d'aquesta relació? Com és la naturalesa feixista?
Thanks for this question. So this is part of a project I conducted with other two colleagues, Marco Armiero and Wilco Hardenberg. So we wrote together this book, Mussolini's Nature. And the main point is that, fascism, well, the environment is a construction of both rhetoric, devices, and policies. So if we look at the environment, we can see exactly the same aspect of fascism that we can see if we look at the institutional process of political process. And specific environments were indeed created to fit specific rhetoric. So the idea, for instance, of the heroic new men of fascism, taming unproductive environment like wetlands, living in very harsh environments like the Alps. So this idea that extreme environments were part of the creation of a new fascist type of man that was not even a citizen, but was this idea of men. And then another important place to check the connection of politics, rhetoric, and nature is the countryside. So the countryside became really like a battlefield for the regime to brought about his idea of ruralization on the one hand. So a very conservative society based on the role of women as the angels of the household, or just as machines to produce newborns. And then on the other side, the countryside became also the space for an intensive science-based modernization. So these are all conflicting ideas that were part of the environment. But we can have many different examples. But just to go to the second part of your question, what is fascist nature like? I mean, there's not a model. So what we claim in the book is that fascism adjusted its approach to nature according to the development of its policies, and different ideas of nature developed together with the regime. So there's not a model that is applicable both in the 1920s and in the 1930s, but there is an evolution of the fascist idea of nature. Maybe one idea that is very present and probably is the quintessential idea of fascist nature is the autarchy nature. So how nature should be exploited to create a self-sufficient country. So I think this is one aspect of that is very prominent in the relationship between fascism and nature.
En la teva última monografia et centres en els aiguamolls. Quins canvis socials, culturals i ambientals van tenir lloc a les llacunes pontines a causa de la recuperació integral feixista?
So the beginning of this idea of reclamation was emerged in the 1928, and then in the 1930s, the Pontine marshes really experienced the most impressive environmental transformation that occurred in all modern Italy. So that was a massive transformation that came completely unexpected. Even members of the fascist party or the fascist institutions were surprised when Mussolini decided to cut a huge forest. So it was one of the largest plain forest in all Europe, a wetland that was around 30,000 hectares large. So fascism really changed completely all the ecological relations among species. So there was the removal of specific animals, the cut of specific trees. Then they drained the area through an intensive use of electricity. New technology was brought in the 1930s. So from a social point of view, so all the commoners that used to use the area were completely evicted in the 1930s, and they were replaced with specific groups that were moved from another area of the country. So they wanted really to recreate a different landscape, and they wanted to do that by transforming an unproductive area, like a marshland, into the model of the most productive area from an agricultural point of view.
Com es va promoure la imatge de les dones en relació amb la natura en la retòrica feixista?
The same thing that we said for the types of nature, ideas of nature, applies to women. So there's not a single model. So it really depends on the different class. But of course, the more or women of the upper class, of course, had a very had a different relation with the environment. They also interacted with colonial environment as travelers. So there are many ways in which women interacted with nature under the regime, but probably the most widespread one is the connection with the keyword of ruralism. So how women were seen in the production of the specific idea of fascist family. So women had to have at least 5 or 6 children. So this was the idea of the basic family unit in the 1930s. And when women were selected to be placed in different areas, their fertility capacity was one of the major elements that based the selection. Then another way to look at the relation between fascism and women is to look at food. So how women worked in the rice fields, for instance, in the north of Italy, and or how women cooked during the fascist regime. And on this, there's a very interesting book by Diana Garvin, and she explored this concept of tabletop politics, so how politics and food provided women like a role in the regime. But there are a lot of other models that probably we should explore more, also to look at the agency of women. So how women resisted fascist politics by cooking different things or producing different agricultural products or working in factories. So I think there's a lot to be researched on the relation between women and fascism in general, and of course, environmental history should contribute.
La fal·làcia colonial de la terra buida i la restauració de la fertilitat han estat crucials en les colonitzacions. Com es van convertir els territoris africans en laboratoris?
As all colonial projects, and this is like an element that recurs in all environmental history, but in general colonial history, the first impression or how to create the ideal colonial space is to claim that, okay, there's nothing, and especially for the case of Libya, this was particularly easy to be done because Libya is 95% covered by desert. So the European mindset of looking at an environment as productive only when is verdant or only when is intensively used was completely different from what the idea of how to use the desert should be. So I think Libya is it's a very interesting case, and they transformed not all Libya, but a very tiny fraction of the colony into a laboratory. So more or less the transformation of the colony amounted to 0.2%. And this 0.2% became model farms, imported specific cows, but then again, they encountered the ecological limits of the lack of water. And the same happened with plants. They imported specific trees, they tried to make them work, and actually they worked only through a very energivore regime. So when they could use a lot of energy, pump water from the underground, they transformed this small farm into model farms, but it was not a model that could be expanded to the whole country. So nothing remained of the Italian colonizations after the World War II. So there were villages, of course, there were Italian settlers that stayed there, but from an environmental perspective, I think we should really ask if the desert was transformed or not.
Gràcies mille, Roberta. Aquest ha estat l'últim episodi de la 4ª temporada de Fem Ciència. Ens veiem aviat. Gràcies.